Part 1. The Crossroads at Dusk. The day had been long, and your feet carried you forward more from habit than intention. The forest path you'd been following had grown narrower as afternoon faded into evening, the canopy above thickening until only fragments of amber sky filtered through the leaves. You weren't lost, not exactly, but you had no clear sense of where this particular path might lead, only a gentle intuition that it would take you somewhere you needed to be. The air had that particular quality of autumn twilight, cool enough to make you draw your cloak a little tighter, but not cold. Not unwelcoming. Around you, the forest breathed with the sounds of day settling into night, the last calls of birds finding their roosts, the whisper of wind through branches losing their leaves, the subtle rustling of small creatures beginning their nocturnal wanderings. You weren't afraid. The forest felt old in the way of places that have seen countless seasons turn, places that hold memory in their roots and soil. Ancient, but kind. Patient. And then, as the path curved around a massive oak whose trunk was as wide as a cottage, you came to a crossroads. For paths met here in a small clearing where the last of the daylight pooled like liquid gold. The earth was soft beneath your feet, covered in a carpet of moss and fallen leaves that muffled your footsteps. At the very center of the crossroads stood a post, weathered wood, smoothed by time and touch, and hanging from it was a lantern. It glowed. Not with the harsh brightness of a torch or the flickering uncertainty of a candle struggling against wind, but with a steady, warm luminescence that seemed to come from within the lantern itself. The light was golden amber, the color of honey held up to sunlight, and it cast no harsh shadows. Instead, it seemed to soften everything it touched, making the crossroads feel like a place outside of time, a pocket of peace in the vast turning of the world. You stopped, your hand instinctively reaching out toward the lantern, though you didn't quite touch it. There was something welcoming about that light, something that made the weariness in your bones feel acknowledged, seen, understood. As you stood there, you noticed that one of the four paths, the one leading to your left, winding deeper into the forest where the trees grew closer together, was lined with more lanterns. They hung from branches at intervals, each one glowing with that same gentle amber light, creating a pathway of illumination that beckoned without demanding, invited without insisting. You'd heard stories, of course. Travelers always share stories. Tales of magical inns that appear only to those who need them most, of places where time moves differently, where rest is deeper and more restorative than ordinary sleep. You'd always thought them merely stories, the kind of thing people tell each other around campfires to make the darkness feel less vast. But standing here, with that warm light beckoning and your body aching for rest you hadn't quite admitted you needed, the stories felt less like fantasy and more like possibility. The decision, when it came, wasn't really a decision at all. Your feet simply began to move, carrying you down the lantern-lit path as naturally as water flowing downhill. Each lantern you passed seemed to glow a little brighter as you approached, as if recognizing you, welcoming you forward. The forest around the path grew darker as you walked, but you felt no concern. The lanterns created a corridor of safety, a river of light flowing through the dimness. The path itself was smooth, surprisingly so, as if it were walked often despite the wildness of the surrounding woods. Roots that might have caught your foot seemed to curve away from the path. Stones that might have turned your ankle were conspicuously absent. You walked for what might have been 10 minutes or 30. Time felt elastic here, stretched and comfortable, and with each step, you felt some of the tension you'd been carrying begin to ease from your shoulders. The path descended gently, following the natural contours of the land, winding between trees that seemed to lean in protectively overhead. And then, through a gap in the trees ahead, you saw more lights. Not just the amber glow of the lanterns now, but the warm golden orange of windows lit from within, the welcoming illumination that speaks of hearth fires and safety and home. The path opened into a small clearing, and there, nestled against the hillside as if it had grown there as naturally as the trees, was an inn. Part 2, Arrival at the Lantern Inn. The inn revealed itself gradually, emerging from the twilight like something conjured from wishes and weariness. It was built of honey-colored stone that seemed to hold the memory of sunlight even in the growing darkness, 2 stories tall with a steep slate roof and multiple chimneys from which thin wisps of fragrant smoke drifted upward. Ivy climbed the walls, its leaves turning burgundy and gold with the season, and tucked among the vines were dozens, no, hundreds, of paper lanterns in shades of cream, amber, and soft rose, each one glowing gently. The inn wasn't large, not in the way of city establishments built to house dozens of travelers. It had an intimate quality, the size of a generous home, the kind of place that might hold 20 guests at most, each one welcomed individually rather than processed as a transaction. A wooden sign hung above the arched doorway, carved with elegant letters that read simply, "The Lantern Inn." Below it, in smaller script, "Rest for the weary. Light for the lost." The door itself was painted a deep, soothing blue, and on either side stood 2 particularly large lanterns, their light steady and warm. Beside the door, a small bench offered a place to sit, and on it lay a striped cat, orange and white, who opened one eye to regard you with the casual assessment cats reserved for newcomers, then closed it again, apparently deciding you were acceptable. You approached slowly, giving yourself time to take it all in, the window boxes still holding late-blooming flowers in shades of purple and white, the way the lantern light reflected off the small pane windows, the sound of water trickling somewhere nearby, a fountain or stream, musical and peaceful. As you reached the door, it opened before you could knock. The woman who stood in the doorway was perhaps 50, perhaps timeless, one of those people whose age becomes irrelevant in the face of their presence. She was shorter than you by a hand's width, with a sturdy, comfortable build and silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a loose braid. Her eyes were the color of warm earth, and they crinkled at the corners as she smiled. She wore practical clothes, a long skirt in deep brown, a cream-colored blouse with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, and an apron embroidered with tiny lanterns along the hem. Around her neck hung a single pendant, a small glass sphere containing what appeared to be a captured spark of light, glowing faintly. "Welcome," she said, and her voice matched her appearance perfectly, warm, unhurried, genuinely pleased. "Welcome to the Lantern Inn. My name is Mirabelle, and I'm the keeper here. You've had a long journey, haven't you?" It wasn't really a question. She stepped aside, gesturing you in with a movement that was both invitation and reassurance. Come in. Come in. You're just in time for supper, and your room is ready." You stepped across the threshold, and immediately the weariness you'd been carrying became more apparent, not worse, but acknowledged. As if being in this place gave you permission to finally feel how tired you truly were. The entry hall was everything the exterior promised. The floors were wide wooden planks, worn smooth by decades of footsteps, covered here and there with woven rugs in warm colors, rust and gold and deep green. The walls were plastered and painted a soft cream, hung with watercolor paintings of forest scenes and botanical studies. A staircase curved upward to the left, its banister carved with a pattern of leaves and vines. But what drew your attention most were the lanterns. They hung at varying heights throughout the space, each one unique. Some were paper, some were glass, some appeared to be made of thin, translucent wood. They cast a gentle, layered light that eliminated all harshness, creating pockets of illumination that felt intimate and safe. The air smelled of wood smoke and baking bread, of herbs and old books, of beeswax polish and the indefinable scent of a place that has been well loved for a very long time. "Let me take your cloak," Mirabelle said, her hands already reaching to help you shrug out of the travel-worn garment. She hung it on a hook by the door, one of a dozen wooden pegs carved to look like branches. "And your pack, if you'd like. Though if you'd prefer to keep it with you until you've seen your room, that's perfectly fine too." There was no pressure in her words, no expectation. Just gentle offerings. "Your room, I think," you heard yourself say, surprised at how easily the words came, how safe you felt already. "Of course," Mirabelle smiled. "Follow me, then. It's just upstairs, and I think you'll find it quite comfortable." She led you up the staircase, which creaked in a friendly, settled way, each step solid and sure. The walls along the stairs held more paintings, and you noticed that each one featured lanterns, lanterns in windows, lanterns hanging from trees, lanterns lighting paths through darkness. At the top of the stairs, a hallway stretched in both directions, lined with doors painted in various soft colors, sage green, dusty blue, warm gray. Mirabelle turned right, leading you past 3 doors before stopping at one painted the color of evening sky, that particular blue just after sunset. She produced a key from her apron pocket, an old-fashioned brass key on a ribbon, and unlocked the door, pushing it open and stepping aside so you could enter first. "Welcome to your room," she said simply. "Welcome home, for however long you need, a room of one's own." The room embraced you before you'd taken 2 steps inside. That was the only way to describe it, not just a physical space, but a feeling of being welcomed, of being exactly where you needed to be. It wasn't large. Cozy, rather than cramped. The kind of size that feels secure rather than confining, like being wrapped in a favorite blanket. The walls were painted a soft, warm white with the faintest hint of cream, and the ceiling sloped gently on one side, following the line of the roof, making the space feel nestled, protected. To your left, a bed stood against the wall, and such a bed it was, an old wooden frame, carved with simple elegance, piled high with quilts and pillows and layers of texture and pattern. The bottom quilt was a deep forest green, the next a patchwork of cream and gold, the top one a lighter sage color. The pillows were various sizes, some covered in linen, others in soft flannel, arranged in a way that looked both artful and comfortable. The whole ensemble looked impossibly inviting, the kind of bed you could sink into and forget the world existed. Across from the bed, under a window with small square panes, sat a writing desk of warm wood, simple but well-made. On it, a ceramic cup holding pens and pencils, a small stack of paper, and a glass bottle of ink. A cushioned chair was tucked beneath the desk, upholstered in fabric the color of autumn leaves. The window itself drew your attention immediately. It looked out over what must be the inn's garden, and though darkness had mostly fallen, you could see the glow of more lanterns among what appeared to be trees and flowering plants. The window was dressed with curtains and a light, flowing fabric, unbleached linen, perhaps, that you could draw for privacy but which now let in the soft glow from outside. On the wall beside the window hung 2 watercolors in simple wooden frames, one of a forest path lined with lanterns, the other of a window with a cat sitting on the sill, looking out at stars. A wardrobe stood in the corner, tall and substantial, carved from dark wood that had been polished to a soft gleam. Beside it, a small bookshelf held perhaps 24 volumes, their spines showing titles you couldn't quite read from where you stood, but which promised comfort, poetry, perhaps, and gentle stories, books meant for peaceful reading before sleep. In another corner, a washstand held a ceramic basin and pitcher, both painted with a delicate pattern of leaves. Folded towels sat beside them, thick and soft-looking. Above the washstand, a small mirror in a wooden frame reflected the room's warm light. And the lighting, oh, the lighting! There were no harsh candles or bright lamps. Instead, 2 lanterns hung from the ceiling at different heights, casting that same gentle amber glow you'd followed through the forest. On the bedside table, another lantern sat, smaller, with a delicate handle for carrying. And on the desk, yet another, this one with glass panels that cast tiny patterns of light and shadow. The floor was wooden, like downstairs, covered with a large woven rug in shades of brown, cream, and dusty blue. It looked soft enough to walk on barefoot, thick enough to warm your feet on a cold morning. "The washroom is just down the hall," Mirabelle said from the doorway, her voice quiet, respectful of the peace in the room. "3rd door on the left. There's a bath there with hot water, always hot water, one of the small magics of the inn. Soap, towels, everything you might need. Feel free to use it whenever you like." You set your pack down gently on the chair by the desk, feeling the relief of letting go of that weight. "Take your time settling in," Mirabelle continued. "Supper will be served in about half an hour in the dining room, down the stairs, follow the hall to the right, you can't miss it. But there's no rush. If you prefer a tray sent up, or if you need more time to rest, just let me know. We're very flexible here." Time moves, gently at the lantern end. She smiled, and you noticed again how her whole face warmed when she did, how her eyes held genuine kindness without any trace of performance or professional courtesy. This wasn't just an innkeeper doing her job. This was someone who genuinely cared about the comfort and well-being of those who found their way here. "Thank you," you said, and the words felt inadequate for what you were feeling, gratitude, yes, but also relief, and a strange sense of homecoming for a place you'd never been before. "You're so welcome," Mirabelle said. "Truly. Rest now. We'll talk more later, if you like, or not at all, if you prefer. Everything here is at your own pace." She closed the door with a soft click, leaving you alone in the golden lamplight. For a long moment, you simply stood in the center of the room, feeling the silence settle around you like silk. It wasn't an empty silence, but a full one, the silence of a place at peace with itself, where there was no need to fill the space with noise or distraction. You moved to the window first, drawn by the view. The garden below was larger than you'd realized, stretching back into what seemed to be a small orchard. The lanterns hanging from branches and posts created pools of light throughout the space, illuminating glimpses of pathways, flower beds, a stone fountain, benches placed in thoughtful locations. Here and there, you could see the silhouettes of other guests, people walking slowly along the paths, or sitting quietly on benches, or simply standing still, looking up at the emerging stars. The night sky visible above the garden was remarkable, more stars than you'd seen in years, brilliant and clear. No moon yet, but the stars provided their own illumination, competing with the lanterns for your attention. You tested the bed next, sitting on the edge first, then lying back against the pillows. The quilts were every bit as soft as they looked, the mattress firm but yielding in all the right places. The pillows cradled your head perfectly, and you had to resist the immediate urge to simply close your eyes and drift off right then. But supper. And curiosity. and the sense that there was more to discover about this place before surrendering to sleep. You rose, moved to the wardrobe, and opened it to find it empty except for extra blankets folded on a shelf, spare pillows, and a thick robe hanging from a hook, dark blue, soft as clouds, with a note pinned to it that read, "For your comfort, whenever needed." The bookshelf called to you next. The titles were indeed what you'd hoped for: collections of poetry, gentle fantasy novels, books about nature and gardens, a few volumes of what appeared to be journals or essays. Books meant for quiet contemplation, for peace, for drifting off mid-page into pleasant dreams. The dining room gathering. After washing and changing into your cleanest shirt, you made your way back down the curved staircase. Your hand trailed along the smooth banister, and you found yourself moving slowly, unhurried, matching the pace of the inn itself. There was no rush here. No urgency. Time didn't press but simply flowed. At the bottom of the stairs, you could hear the soft murmur of voices and smell something wonderful: roasted vegetables, fresh bread, herbs you couldn't quite name but that made your mouth water and your stomach remind you it had been hours since your last meal. You followed the hallway to the right, as Mirabelle had directed, past a few closed doors and one open one that revealed a glimpse of a sitting room with comfortable chairs arranged around a fireplace. And then you reached an archway hung with a curtain of wooden beads that clicked together gently as you passed through. The dining room was larger than you'd expected, but still intimate. A long wooden table occupied the center of the space, clearly made from a single massive plank of some ancient tree, its surface worn smooth by countless meals and conversations. It was set for perhaps a dozen people, though only about half the seats were occupied. The walls here were exposed stone on one side, the original exterior wall of the inn, you realized, and plastered on the others, painted the color of warm honey. More lanterns hung at various heights, and candles and glass holders ran down the center of the table, their flames steady and bright. Windows lined one wall, and though it was fully dark outside now, you could see the reflection of the room's warm light in the glass, making the space feel doubled, infinite. A fire crackled in a large stone hearth at one end of the room, and hanging above it was a copper pot that released steam scented with rosemary and something sweet, apple, perhaps. Beside the hearth, shelves held blue and white pottery plates, bowls, cups, and serving dishes. Mirabelle moved between the table and a side door that must lead to the kitchen, carrying dishes and platters. She looked up as you entered and smiled that warm, welcoming smile again. "Ah, perfect timing," she said. "Come, sit wherever you like. We're not formal here. Every seat is a good seat." You chose a place roughly in the middle of the table, in a high-backed wooden chair with a cushion in deep red fabric. As you settled, you became aware of the other guests, and they of you. There were nods, gentle smiles, the kind of acknowledgement that respects both connection and privacy. To your right sat a woman who might have been in her 30s, with dark skin and hair woven in intricate braids decorated with small wooden beads. She wore spectacles with round lenses and had ink stains on her fingers. Before her on the table lay a leather-bound journal, closed now, with a pen resting on top. "Hello," she said, her voice melodic and warm. "I'm Kasia. I'm a mapmaker. Or I was. Or I will be again. Here, I'm not quite sure what I am, except rested." She laughed softly. "First time at the Lantern Inn?" You nodded. I am. I barely know how I found it. Same with all of us, said a voice from across the table. You looked up to see a man with silver hair pulled back in a tail, wearing a vest over a linen shirt, his hands showing the calluses of someone who worked with them. He had a gentle, weathered face and eyes that crinkled with perpetual almost smile. The inn finds you, I think, more than you find it. I'm Garrett. I'm a woodworker by trade, though lately I've been. He paused, searching for words, recovering, I suppose, from life. Several people around the table made soft sounds of agreement, understanding. I'm Elena, offered a younger woman to your left, her hair a cascade of auburn curls, her hands wrapped around a mug of something steaming. Musician. Or trying to be. The lantern Inn has been a gift. A place to remember why I loved music in the first place, before it became all about performance and perfection. More introductions followed. Thomas, a botanist with soil still under his fingernails and leaves in his pockets. Leanne, a physician who spoke little but listened deeply. Margaret, an older woman who knitted while others talked, her needles clicking softly, who said she was between chapters and left it at that. Each person had come here carrying something: weariness, loss, confusion, the weight of expectations, or simply the accumulated exhaustion of living in a world that demanded so much. And each had found, in the Lantern Inn, a place to set those burdens down, at least for a while. Mirabelle began bringing food to the table, and others rose to help, not out of obligation, you sensed, but because it felt natural to participate in the communal act of nourishing each other. Platters appeared, roasted root vegetables glazed with honey and herbs, dark bread still warm from the oven, a creamy soup thick with mushrooms and grains, a salad of late-season grains and edible flowers, a soft cheese that smelled of herbs and cream. Everything was served family-style, passed from hand to hand, each person taking what they wanted without any sense of scarcity or competition. There was more than enough. There would always be more than enough. Thank you, you said automatically as Kasia passed you the bread basket, and she smiled. It's easy to remember gratitude here, isn't it? She said. The inn makes it natural. The meal unfolded slowly, deliciously. The food tasted like comfort itself, nothing overly complex or trying to impress, just simple, perfect ingredients prepared with care. The soup warmed you from the inside. The bread was crusty outside and soft within, perfect with butter that melted into golden pools. The vegetables were sweet and savory at once, caramelized to perfection. But even better than the food was the conversation, or rather, the quality of it. People spoke when they had something to say and were silent when they didn't. Stories were shared without performative energy, without anyone trying to top anyone else's tale. People asked questions because they genuinely wanted to know the answers, and they listened to responses with full attention. Garrett told about a chair he was making, describing the grain of the wood with such love that you could almost see it. Elena spoke about rediscovering a melody she'd written years ago and forgotten, how it had come back to her while walking in the inn's garden. Thomas described a particular moss he'd found growing on the north side of the inn, luminescent in certain light, possibly magical or possibly just beautiful, and here, what was the difference? The conversation flowed like water, finding its own channels, splitting and rejoining. Sometimes the whole table was engaged in one topic, sometimes smaller conversations bloomed between neighbors. Always, there was the underlying current of gentleness, of people who had been given permission to be tired, to be uncertain, to be simply themselves without justification. Mirabelle sat down when the food had all been served, taking a seat at the head of the table with her own plate, joining the gathering as an equal rather than a service. She ate and talked and laughed with everyone else, and you realized this wasn't a business to her, not really. It was a calling. A kind of magic. As the meal drew to a close, though no one seemed rushed, and people continued to sit and talk and sip tea or spiced cider, Mirabelle looked around the table with evident satisfaction. "The library is open for those who'd like to read by the fire," she said. "And Elena, if you feel moved to play later, the music room is always ready. The garden is lovely under the stars, if anyone wants to walk. Or you're welcome to simply retire to your rooms. Whatever calls to you." Part 5, The Library of Light. You helped clear the table, not because anyone asked, but because it felt right, carrying dishes through the swinging door into a kitchen that was exactly as you'd imagined, warm, fragrant, full of hanging herbs and copper pots, a massive stove radiating gentle heat, windows that would let in morning light, and more of those ever-present lanterns casting their soft glow. Afterward, drawn by curiosity and the promise of quiet contemplation, you followed Mirabelle's direction to the library. You found it down a short hallway on the ground floor, through a door carved with the image of an open book. The door wasn't locked, none of the doors in the inn seemed to be, and it opened silently on well-oiled hinges. The library took your breath away. It was a circular room. You realized you must be in one of the inn's towers, with walls covered floor to ceiling and built-in bookshelves. The shelves were honey-colored wood, fitted so precisely to the curved walls that they seemed to have grown there. Every shelf was full, but not crammed. The books were arranged with space to breathe, to be seen, to be chosen. In the center of the room, a spiral staircase wound upward, suggesting the library continued to the floor above. The stairs were iron-worked in a pattern of vines and leaves, painted dark green, with wooden treads worn smooth in the center. The furniture was exactly what a library should hold, deep armchairs upholstered in leather and velvet, worn comfortable rather than shabby. Small tables beside each chair for setting down tea or books. Footstools and ottomans. A window seat built into one of the few spaces not covered by shelves, piled with cushions in jewel tones, sapphire, emerald, ruby. And near the large fireplace, a sofa long enough to stretch out on completely, covered in fabric the color of midnight sky. The fireplace itself was remarkable, stone, with a carved mantel depicting a forest scene complete with tiny lanterns hidden among the trees. A fire burned steadily, perfectly sized to warm without overheating, and the wood gave off a scent like cedar and applewood combined. And there, on a small rug before the fire, lay a cat. It was a large cat, long-haired, with fur in shades of orange and cream and charcoal, arranged in patches and swirls that made each side of its body look different. It had one green eye and one gold, and it regarded you with the serene confidence of a creature who knew it was exactly where it belonged. "That's Ember," came a soft voice, and you turned to see Thomas, the botanist, settled in one of the armchairs with a book in his lap and spectacles perched on his nose. The library cat. Or perhaps more accurately, this is Ember's library, and he allows us to use it. As if in acknowledgement, Ember stood, stretched with that particular feline grace that makes the movement look like liquid, and padded over to you. He wound between your ankles once, twice, then returned to his rug and settled back down, curling into a perfect spiral with his tail wrapped around his nose. "I think you've been approved," Thomas said with a smile, returning his attention to his book. You moved deeper into the room, drawn as if by magnetism to the shelves. Your fingers trailed along spines as you circled the room: poetry collections, nature writing, philosophy, folk tales and fairy stories, travel writing, memoirs, novels that promised gentle adventures or domestic magic, or the kind of stories that end with understanding rather than resolution. On one shelf, you found an entire section devoted to sleep, books about dreams, about the science and poetry of rest, about insomnia and its gentle remedies, about the mythology of night. On another, books about light, astronomy, the physics of illumination, the history of lighthouses, guides to candle making and the crafting of lanterns. You selected a slim volume bound in dark blue cloth, its title stamped in fading gold: The Night Garden, Essays on Rest and Renewal. Carrying it to one of the chairs near the fire, not too close to Thomas, respecting his reading solitude, but near enough to share the warmth, you settled in. The chair embraced you. There was no other word for it. The leather was soft with age and use, the cushions shaped by countless readers who had sat here before you. A small table stood beside the chair, and on it, someone had left a cup of chamomile tea, still steaming. You didn't question it. Things appeared at the lantern and when you needed them. You opened the book to a random page and began to read. Rest is not the absence of activity, but the presence of peace. A garden at night does not cease to be a garden, it simply gardens in a different way. In darkness, seeds split open. Roots drink deeply. Flowers gather strength for tomorrow's blooming. The night garden is not less than the day garden, it is simply, beautifully different. The words washed over you like water, each sentence a small gift. You read slowly, sometimes rereading passages that struck you particularly deeply, sometimes simply letting your eyes rest on the page while your mind wandered. The fire crackled softly. Pages turned, yours, Thomas's, and perhaps someone else's who had entered the library so quietly you hadn't noticed. Ember purred, a sound like distant thunder, peaceful and grounding, outside the windows, and you could see several from where you sat, the circular room offering views in multiple directions. The night had deepened to true darkness. Stars were brilliant against the black, and the lanterns in the garden glowed like earthbound constellations. Time lost its meaning. You might have read for 20 minutes or 2 hours. It didn't matter. There was no schedule to keep, no obligation waiting. Just this, a comfortable chair, a book that spoke to your soul, a fire's warmth, a cat's purring, and the profound, almost shocking piece of a place where you could simply be. Eventually, Mirabelle appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray with a teapot and cups. She moved around the room quietly, refilling Thomas's cup, pouring tea for an older gentleman you hadn't seen enter who sat in the window seat, and finally stopping beside your chair. "More tea?" she asked softly. "Please," you said, and watched as she poured a stream of amber liquid into your cup, releasing steam scented with herbs and a hint of honey. "The library stays open all night," she said. "Some guests find they do their best reading in the small hours. But your room is there whenever you're ready to sleep. No pressure. No expectations. Just follow what your body needs." She moved on, and you sipped the tea, perfect temperature, perfect flavor, perfect everything, and returned to your book. Another chapter. Another essay about the necessity of rest in a world that praised exhaustion, about finding stillness in the midst of chaos, about making peace with the parts of yourself that needed darkness and quiet to grow. Ember stirred, stood, walked over to your chair, and jumped up with surprising grace for his size. He circled once on your lap, kneading with his paws, then settled down, a warm, purring weight. His trust was absolute, his comfort complete. You set the book aside and simply sat, one hand resting on Ember's soft fur, the other holding your teacup, and stared into the fire. Your mind drifted. Not sleeping, but not quite awake either, that pleasant in-between state where thoughts bubble up gently without demanding attention. You thought about the path that had led you here, about the crossroads lantern, about how much you'd needed this without knowing you needed it. In the lantern's library, with its circular walls of books and its patient cat and its eternal fire, you felt something you hadn't felt in so long you'd almost forgotten what it was called. Part 6: The Legend of the Lanterns. You set the book aside and simply sat, one hand resting on Ember's soft fur, the other holding your teacup, and stared into the fire. Your mind drifted. Not sleeping, but not quite awake either, that pleasant in-between state where thoughts bubble up gently without demanding attention. You thought about the path that had led you here, about the crossroads lantern, about how much you'd needed this without knowing you needed it. The fire crackled, and you became aware of Mirabelle settling into the chair beside yours, a cup of tea in her own hands. She didn't speak immediately, just sat in companionable silence, both of you watching the flames dance and shift. "You're wondering about the lanterns," she said after a while, her voice soft, not quite a question. You nodded. "They seem more than just light." "They are," Mirabelle said, and her voice took on a different quality, the tone of someone about to share something old and true. "Would you like to hear how the lanterning came to be?" "Very much," you said. Mirabelle settled deeper into her chair, her face timeless in the firelight. Long ago, this was simply a crossroads in the forest. For paths meeting, nothing more. But it was a place where travelers often became lost, where the darkness felt particularly deep, where people sat down exhausted and weren't sure they could go on. She paused, sipping her tea, letting the story breathe. A woman lived nearby. Some say she was a healer, some say a witch, some say simply someone who understood loneliness. She would walk the forest paths at night, and she would find these travelers, cold, afraid, uncertain. And she would bring them to her cottage, give them soup and bread, let them sleep by her fire. The library had grown very quiet. Even Ember's purring seemed to soften, as if the cat too was listening. But her cottage was small, and more travelers came each season. So she began to hang lanterns at the crossroads, simple things at first, just candles and paper holders. But she made them with care, with intention. She would sit and fold the paper, light the candles, and whisper into each one, "Be a light for the lost. Be warmth for the weary. Be hope for those who have forgotten it." Mirabelle's voice was gentle, rhythmic, the cadence of an old tale told around countless fires. The travelers began to follow the lanterns to her door. And slowly, others came to help. A carpenter built rooms onto the cottage. A gardener planted flowers and herbs. A cook came to make meals. The cottage grew into this inn, stone by stone, room by room, always with the lanterns showing the way. "What happened to the woman?" you asked softly. Mirabelle smiled. "Some say she's still here, in the walls and the warmth. Some say each keeper of the inn carries her forward. Some say anyone who lights a lantern with love and intention becomes her, just for that moment." She reached up and touched the pendant at her neck, the small glass sphere with its captured spark of light. "The lanterns are lit with starlight now, gathered on clear nights and held in glass until needed. It's a small magic, a quiet one. But magic doesn't need to be loud to be powerful." "And time?" you asked, remembering how she'd said time moved differently here. "Time moves at the pace of healing," Mirabelle said simply. "However long you need to rest, to remember who you were beneath the exhaustion, that's how long you can stay. Some guests are here for a night. Some for a season. The inn holds you until you're ready to go." She stood, gently, and placed her hand briefly on your shoulder. "Rest well tonight. Tomorrow, if you wish, explore the garden properly. There's more to see than you might think." And with that, she moved away, tending to other guests, leaving you with the story settling into your heart like a seed in warm earth. Part 7: The Evening Garden Walk. After some time lost in thought, you gently displaced Ember from your lap. He stretched and yawned, unbothered, and returned the book to its shelf. The library would be here tomorrow, and you felt called to something else now: the garden, the night air, the stars. You made your way through the quiet hallways of the inn, past closed doors behind which other guests were finding their own peace. The entry hall was dim now, just a few lanterns glowing softly. You found the side door that led to the garden and opened it carefully. The night air greeted you, cool but not cold, carrying the scent of earth and late-blooming flowers and something else, something indefinably magical. You stepped out onto a stone path, and the door closed softly behind you. The garden unfolded before you like a secret being shared. The paths were paved with smooth stones that reflected the lantern light, winding between beds of flowers and herbs, beneath arbors heavy with sleeping vines, around corners that promised discoveries. Lanterns hung everywhere, from tree branches, from posts, from hooks in the stone walls that bordered parts of the garden. Each one cast a pool of amber light, and together they created a constellation at ground level, a mirror of the stars above. You walked slowly, letting your feet choose the path. To your left, you passed a bed of late-season roses, their petals luminous in the darkness, deep reds and soft pinks, and one bloom of pure white that seemed to glow from within. Their scent was gentle, not overwhelming, a whisper rather than a shout. The path curved, and you found yourself beside the fountain you'd heard earlier. It was made of stone, weathered and beautiful, with water spilling from 3 tiers. The sound was musical, peaceful, the kind of sound that could lull you into meditation without effort. Around the fountain's base grew small ferns and moss, thriving in the constant moisture, and someone had placed smooth river stones in patterns that pleased the eye without demanding attention. You sat on the fountain's wide stone edge, feeling the slight mist on your face, and simply breathed. Above you, the stars were impossibly bright, the Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light. You could see constellations you'd learned as a child and ones you'd never noticed before. The moon had not yet risen, giving the stars their full glory. Other guests moved through the garden. You could see them as distant silhouettes, hear the occasional murmur of conversation or soft laughter. But the garden was large enough that you never felt crowded, never felt your solitude was being intruded upon. Everyone here understood the need for space, for quiet, for peace. You rose and continued walking. The path led you beneath an arbor covered in some climbing plant that released a sweet scent as you brushed past, jasmine perhaps, or honeysuckle. Beyond the arbor, you discovered a section of the garden you hadn't seen from your window, an herb garden, organized in neat geometric beds, each one labeled with small wooden markers. Even in the darkness, you could smell rosemary and lavender, thyme and sage. Further on, you found a small orchard, apple trees, their branches still holding a few late fruits that glowed golden in the lantern light. The grass beneath the trees was soft, dotted with fallen apples that released their cidery scent into the air. A bench sat beneath the largest tree, and you settled onto it, feeling the solid wood beneath you, the rough bark of the tree at your back. This was peace. Not the absence of sound or movement, but the presence of rightness. Everything in this garden was exactly as it should be, the flowers blooming in their time, the water flowing in its patterns, the stars turning in their ancient courses, and you, sitting here, finally still. Time passed. You couldn't have said how long. Long enough for the tension in your shoulders to fully release. Long enough for your breathing to deepen and slow. Long enough to remember what it felt like to simply exist without purpose or goal, to be rather than to do. Eventually, you rose and made your way back toward the inn, following the lantern-lit paths that seemed to know where you needed to go. The garden released you gently, and you stepped back through the door into the warmth, carrying the night's peace with you. Music by candlelight. Inside, you heard it, a flute, playing somewhere deeper in the inn. The sound was barely more than a whisper, but it called to you, and you followed it down a hallway you hadn't explored before, to a door that stood slightly ajar, warm light spilling through. You pushed the door open gently and found yourself in the music room. It was smaller than the library, more intimate. The walls were paneled in warm wood that seemed to glow in the candlelight, And there were many candles, dozens of them, in holders of various heights, creating layers of soft illumination that made the room feel like the inside of a lantern itself. Chairs and cushions were arranged in a loose circle, and perhaps 7 or 8 guests were already there, some sitting, some reclining against pillows on the floor, all turned toward Elena, the musician you'd met at dinner. She sat in a simple wooden chair, a flute made of some dark wood held loosely in her hands. She hadn't begun playing in earnest yet, just warming up, a note here, a phrase there, the sound like birdsong or wind or water, something natural and free. She looked up as you entered and smiled, nodding toward an empty chair. You settled into it, and someone, Margaret, the knitter, handed you a blanket without a word. You wrapped it around your shoulders, grateful for the warmth and the kindness. "I thought I'd play for a while," Elena said softly to the room. "Nothing formal. Just whatever comes. You're welcome to stay, or to drift in and out, or to fall asleep if the music takes you there. There are no rules in this room except kindness." She lifted the flute to her lips, and the first note emerged, a single, pure tone that seemed to fill the entire space, resonating in the wooden walls, in your chest, in the quiet places of your heart. Then another note. And another. Not a melody yet, just sounds, each one held and released, like breathing. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Nothing complex, a simple 5-note pattern that repeated, varied, wandered away and came back. The melody was ancient and new at once, the kind of tune that felt like it had always existed, was still being created, would never end. Elena's eyes were closed. She swayed slightly as she played, her whole body part of the music. This wasn't performance, this was prayer, meditation, the act of making beauty for its own sake, because beauty was needed and she could provide it. The flute sang of forests and starlight, of paths winding through darkness toward dawn, of rest earned and rest given. It sang of loneliness transformed into solitude, of exhaustion becoming peace, of losing yourself and finding yourself in the same breath. Around you, you could hear others breathing in rhythm with the music. Someone sighed contentedly. The candles flickered in some unfelt breeze, making the shadows dance gently on the walls. Time dissolved. The music was all there was, notes rising and falling like breath, like waves, like the turning of seasons. Sometimes Elena would pause, letting silence fill the space, and the silence was part of the music too, as essential as the sound. You felt your eyes growing heavy, but you fought to stay present, to receive this gift she was giving. The blanket around your shoulders was warm. The chair held you gently. The music wrapped around you like a lullaby, like a blessing, like arms keeping you safe. When Elena finally lowered the flute, the last note fading into silence, no one moved for a long moment. The silence itself felt sacred, something to be honored. Then, softly, someone whispered, "Thank you." Others echoed it, a murmur of gratitude moving through the room like wind through leaves. Elena smiled, her eyes bright. "The music thanks you for listening," she said. "For being present. That's the gift you gave me." Slowly, people began to rise, moving quietly, respectfully. Some headed toward their rooms. Others lingered, speaking in hushed tones. You stood, folded the blanket, and made your way to Elena. "That was beautiful," you said, inadequate words for what you'd experienced. "The lantern makes beauty easier," she said. "Here, I remember why I started making music. Not for applause or recognition, but because sometimes the world needs a song, and I can offer one." You nodded, understanding perfectly, and made your way out of the music room, carrying the melody with you like a light in your heart. Stars from the balcony. Back in your room, you moved quietly, as if any loud sound might break the spell of peace you'd gathered. You lit the small lantern on the bedside table, leaving the others dark, creating just enough light to see by. And then you noticed it, a door you were certain hadn't been there before, or that you simply hadn't seen. It was painted the same soft color as the walls, almost hidden, but now it seemed obvious, necessary, exactly right. You crossed the room and tried the handle. It turned easily, and the door opened outward onto a small balcony you hadn't seen from the garden below. The balcony was just large enough for a wooden chair and a small table. A thick quilt lay folded on the chair, an invitation. You picked it up, wrapped it around yourself, and sat down. The view took your breath away. From here, elevated above the garden, you could see the entire grounds spread out below, the winding paths, the glowing lanterns, the dark shapes of trees and the paler shapes of flower beds. Beyond the garden, the forest stretched away in all directions, a sea of darkness broken here and there by what might have been distant lanterns or might have been stars reflected in water. But it was the sky that commanded your attention. Without city lights to dim them, without even the moon yet risen, the stars were overwhelming in their glory. Thousands upon thousands of them, some bright enough to cast shadows, others barely perceptible, all of them ancient light traveling across impossible distances to reach your eyes in this moment. You could see the constellations clearly, Orion the hunter, standing eternal guard. Cassiopeia in her chair. The Big Dipper pointing toward the North Star. The Pleiades clustered together like a family. A shooting star streaked across the sky, and you made a wish without thinking, without even knowing what you wished for, trusting that your heart knew what you needed. The night air was cool on your face, but the quilt kept your body warm. You could hear the fountain from here, a distant musical murmur. Occasionally, a night bird called. Once, you heard what might have been an owl, its voice a question in the darkness. You sat, and breathed, and watched the stars slowly turn in their ancient dance. Your mind grew quiet, thoughts drifting away like leaves on a stream. You weren't thinking about the past or worrying about the future. You were simply here, now, present in this perfect moment. Inside the room behind you, the small lantern glowed steadily, a warm point of light. Out here, the stars provided their own illumination, cold and distant but somehow also intimate, as if each star was a lantern lit specifically for you. You thought about Mirabelle's story, about the woman who began lighting lanterns at the crossroads. You thought about all the travelers who had found their way here over the years, each one carrying their own weariness, each one receiving rest. You thought about how many people in the world right now were lost, tired, uncertain, and you hoped they would find their own lanterns, their own light in the darkness. Time passed. How long, you couldn't say. long enough for your breathing to synchronize with the gentle wind. Long enough to feel yourself part of the night, part of the garden, part of the vast turning of the cosmos. Eventually, you became aware of being tired, not the exhausted, desperate tired you'd carried into the inn, but a good tired, a clean tired, the tired that comes after a full day well lived and is ready for rest. You rose, folded the quilt, and stepped back inside, closing the balcony door gently. The room welcomed you back, warm and safe. You changed into the soft night clothes you'd found in your pack, washed your face one last time, and turned down the quilts on the bed. Before getting in, you dimmed the lantern until it was barely glowing, just a faint spark of light in the darkness. Then you climbed into bed, and the mattress received you like an embrace. Part 10. The Pulse of Magic. The bed was everything you'd imagined it would be. The mattress supported you perfectly, firm but yielding, cradling your body. The quilts were soft and heavy in the best way, grounding you, making you feel held and safe. The pillows were exactly the right height, the right softness, as if they had been made specifically for you. You lay on your back for a moment, looking up at the ceiling, barely visible in the dim lantern light. Your body began to relax muscle by muscle, your feet, your legs, your back, your shoulders, your neck. Tension you hadn't known you were carrying released and flowed away, absorbed by the bed, the inn, the earth itself. Outside your window, through the sheer curtains, you could see the garden lanterns glowing. And as you watched, half asleep already, you noticed something extraordinary. The lanterns were pulsing. Not flickering like candles in wind, but pulsing, a gentle, rhythmic brightening and dimming, like breathing. Like a heartbeat. You watched, mesmerized. The pulse was slow, peaceful, perhaps 6 or 7 beats per minute. As your breathing slowed to match it, you felt something shift in your body, a deeper relaxation, a sense of being in rhythm with something larger than yourself. The room around you seemed to breathe too. The walls creaked softly, not the alarming creak of something wrong, but the comfortable sound of an old building settling, adjusting, living. The floorboards whispered. The curtains moved slightly though the window was closed. The inn was alive. Not in a frightening way, but in the way a forest is alive, or an ocean, or the earth itself. It had presence, awareness, care. You were sleeping inside something that held you, protected you, wanted you to rest. The pulsing lanterns outside seemed to extend their rhythm into the room. The small lantern on your bedside table joined the pulse, its light growing and fading in perfect synchronization with the others. It was like being surrounded by gentle golden hearts, all beating together, all saying, "Rest, rest, rest." Your own heartbeat slowed to match. Your breathing deepened. You felt yourself sinking into the bed, not falling but being received, welcomed into a deeper state of peace than you'd known was possible. Somewhere in the distance, you heard music, or was it memory? Elena's flute, perhaps, or maybe just the wind moving through the garden in a way that created melody. It didn't matter. Real or imagined, it was beautiful. You became aware of magic moving through the inn like sap through a tree, slow, steady, nurturing. It flowed through the walls, the floors, the lanterns. It flowed through you, healing small wounds you hadn't known were there, soothing fears you'd carried for so long they'd become part of you, filling empty places with warmth and light. This was the heart of the lantern and's magic, not dramatic transformation, but gentle restoration. Not erasing who you were, but reminding you who you'd always been beneath the layers of exhaustion and hurt and doubt. Your eyes grew heavy. You let them close. The pulsing lanterns were still visible through your eyelids, a gentle golden glow that followed you down into sleep. Just before you slipped under completely, you felt it, a presence in the room, though you weren't alarmed. It felt like Mirabelle, or the woman from the story, or perhaps the inn itself, checking on you the way a mother checks on a sleeping child. A hand seemed to rest briefly on your forehead, cool, gentle, blessing. A voice whispered, or perhaps you only imagined it, "Sleep well, dear one. You are safe. You are held. You are home." And then you were falling, but not falling, floating, drifting, being carried on currents of peace deeper and deeper into rest. The golden pulse followed you down, a heartbeat in the darkness, a reminder that even in sleep you were not alone. Dreams came, but they were good dreams, gentle, healing, full of light. You walked through gardens where flowers sang. You flew over forests strung with lanterns. You sat by fires with people you loved, people you'd lost, people you'd never met but recognized anyway. And through it all, the pulse continued, steady and sure, the heartbeat of the inn, the heartbeat of magic, the heartbeat of home. You slept deeper than you had in years. Perhaps in your whole life. And the inn kept Part 11. Gentle morning light. Dawn came softly to the lantern inn, as it came to all things there, gently, without demand, an invitation rather than an alarm. The first thing you became aware of was warmth, the quilt still wrapped around you, the morning sun finding its way through your window, touching your face with fingers of gold. The second thing was sound, birds singing their morning chorus, each voice distinct and beautiful, a celebration of the new day. You didn't wake suddenly. Instead, consciousness returned gradually, like water seeping into sand, natural and unhurried. You became aware of your body, relaxed, rested, free of pain or stiffness. You became aware of the room, familiar now, welcoming, yours for this time. You became aware of peace, still present, still holding you, the gift that kept giving. You opened your eyes slowly, letting them adjust to the light. The room was exactly as you'd left it, but transformed by morning. Where last night everything had been amber and shadow, now everything was gold and clarity. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams. The paintings on the walls showed colors you hadn't noticed in lantern light. The garden outside your window was revealed in full detail, flowers nodding in a slight breeze, butterflies already visiting blossoms, the paths inviting exploration. You stretched, feeling muscles respond with pleasure rather than complaint. The bed released you reluctantly as you sat up, and you noticed something you hadn't seen the night before, a tray sitting just inside your door, on the floor, placed so carefully it hadn't made a sound. You rose and brought it to the bed, settling back against the pillows. On the tray, a thick slice of bread, still faintly warm, with butter and honey in small ceramic pots. A pot of tea with steam rising from the spout, chamomile and something else, something floral and soothing. A small bowl of berries that looked like they'd been picked this morning. And a single flower in a tiny vase, a white rose, perfect and pure. You spread butter and honey on the bread. The butter was rich and golden, the honey thick and fragrant, and took a bite. It was simple food, nothing elaborate, but it tasted like sunlight and care and morning itself. You poured tea into the cup, breathing in its steam before sipping. It warmed you from the inside, completing the work of the night's rest. As you ate, you looked around the room with fresh eyes. You saw details you'd missed, the way the morning light made the wood grain and the furniture glow, the pattern of vines carved into the wardrobe's handles, a small inlaid star on the writing desk. Everything had been made with love, maintained with care. When you finished eating, you rose and went to the washstand. The water in the pitcher was cool and clean, and you washed your face, your hands, feeling fully awake now, fully present. You dressed in fresh clothes from your pack, noticing that somehow they seemed cleaner than they had been, as if the inn itself had refreshed them while you slept. You moved to the window and opened it, letting in the morning air. It carried the scent of flowers and earth, bread baking somewhere in the inn, coffee perhaps, and that indefinable scent of morning itself, possibility, newness, hope. The garden below was alive with activity. You could see Thomas kneeling by a flower bed, examining something with his botanist's attention. Elena sat on a bench with her flute, playing a morning song that rose up to your window like a gift. Other guests walked the paths, some alone, some in pairs, all moving with the unhurried grace that everyone seemed to adopt here. The lanterns were still lit, you noticed, even in full daylight. Their glow was barely visible now, but it was there, constant, faithful, always offering light regardless of whether darkness needed it in that moment. You stood at the window for a long time, feeling the sun on your face, listening to the birds and Elena's flute and the fountain and the gentle sounds of the inn waking up. You felt renewed in a way that went deeper than just physical rest. Something in you had been restored, remembered, returned to itself. Eventually, you knew it was time. Time to go downstairs, to thank Maribel, to begin preparing for the next part of your journey. Because that was the paradox of the Lantern Inn, it gave you rest so complete that you became ready to move forward again, not because you had to, but because you wanted to. You collected your few belongings, packed them carefully. You made the bed, smoothing the quilts, arranging the pillows, leaving the room as you'd found it, ready for the next weary traveler who would need its comfort. At the door, you paused and looked back one more time. Thank you, you whispered to the room, to the inn, to whatever magic resided here. And though no voice answered, you felt the response, a warmth, an acknowledgement, a promise. I'll be here when you need me again. Part 12. The journey continues. Downstairs, the inn was quiet but awake. Morning light filled the entry hall, making the lanterns seem like captured pieces of sunshine. The air smelled of fresh bread and coffee and something sweet, cinnamon, perhaps. You found Maribel in the dining room, setting out breakfast for the guests who would gather soon. She looked up as you entered and smiled, though there was something bittersweet in it, the smile of someone saying a goodbye that's necessary but still a little sad. You're leaving today, she said. Not a question. I think so, you said. I feel ready. Does that make sense? Perfect sense, Maribel said. She set down the plate she was carrying and came to stand before you. That's how we know the inn has done its work when guests feel ready to leave, not because they must, but because they can. Because they've remembered their own strength. Thank you, you said, and the words still felt inadequate. For everything. For this place. For the rest. For reminding me what peace feels like. Mirabelle took your hands in hers. Her palms were warm, callous from work, infinitely gentle. You're always welcome back, she said. The Lantern Inn doesn't forget its guests. If you ever need to return, the lanterns will find you again. Just look for the light. She released your hands and reached into her apron pocket, withdrawing something small. Here, she said. Take this with you. It was a lantern, a miniature version of the ones hanging throughout the inn, no bigger than an apple. It was made of what looked like glass panels held together with copper wire, and inside it, impossibly, a small flame flickered without consuming anything, without needing fuel or air. Your own piece of the inn's light, Mirabelle said. To remind you that rest is always available, that peace is always possible, that you can carry this light with you wherever you go. You took the lantern carefully, feeling its slight weight, its warmth. The flame inside pulsed gently, that same rhythm you'd seen last night, the heartbeat of magic. I don't know how to thank you enough, you said. Live well, Mirabelle said simply. Rest when you need to. Be kind to yourself and others. Pass the light on when someone else needs it. That's thanks enough. Other guests had begun appearing, Kasia and Garrett, Thomas and Elena, Margaret and others whose names you'd learned over dinner. They'd come to see you off, you realized, these people who'd been strangers yesterday and who felt like old friends now. There were hugs, warm and genuine. Promises to remember each other. Shared understanding that this place had changed all of you in ways both subtle and profound. Ember appeared and wound between your ankles one last time, purring his farewell. You bent and scratched behind his ears, receiving a slow blink in return, a cat's kiss, trust and affection. Finally, with your pack on your shoulders and the small lantern held carefully in your hand, you walked to the door. Mirabelle opened it for you, and morning light spilled in, bright and warm and full of promise. The path will take you where you need to go, she said. Trust it, as you trusted the lanterns to bring you here. You stepped outside. The morning was glorious, clear sky, gentle breeze, birds singing in the trees. The garden stretched before you, and beyond it, you could see the path leading back into the forest, back toward the crossroads, back toward the world. But you were different now. Lighter. Stronger. More yourself. You turned back one more time. Mirabelle stood in the doorway, backlit by the inn's golden glow, raising her hand in farewell. The lantern inn rose behind her, stone and ivy and hundreds of lanterns, looking exactly as it had when you'd arrived, looking like it had stood there forever and would stand there forevermore. Thank you, you called one final time. Mirabelle's smile was radiant. Safe travels, dear one. Until we meet again. You turned and began walking down the path. The lanterns were still lit, even in daylight, guiding you just as they'd guided you in. You walked slowly, savoring each step, looking at everything, the flowers, the trees, the way sunlight filtered through leaves, the beauty of the ordinary world that you could see more clearly now, with rested eyes and a peaceful heart. The forest welcomed you back. Not threatening, not confusing, but simply present, trees and earth and growing things, all part of the same vast living system that you were part of too. You walked, and as you walked, you felt the small lantern's warmth in your hand, its gentle pulse matching your heartbeat. You felt the peace of the inn still surrounding you, not left behind but carried forward, a gift that would remain. The crossroads appeared ahead, the weathered post, the four paths meeting. The original lantern still hung there, still glowing, waiting for the next weary traveler who would need its light. You paused at the crossroads, looking back the way you'd come. You couldn't see the inn anymore, the forest had closed around it, keeping it safe, keeping it secret. But you knew it was there. You would always know it was there. Then you chose your path, not the one you'd arrived by, but a different one, a path you hadn't considered before. Because that was the gift the lantern inn had given you, not just rest, but renewal. Not just peace, but possibility. The courage to try new paths, to trust yourself, to carry light into whatever darkness you might encounter. You walked forward, the small lantern glowing in your hand, the forest opening before you, the day stretching ahead full of promise. You didn't know where this path would lead, but you weren't afraid. You had rested. You had remembered who you were. You carried light. And somewhere behind you, hidden in the trees, the lantern inn continued its work, lanterns glowing, fire crackling, ember purring, Mirabelle welcoming a new traveler who had just found the crossroads, who had just seen the light, who was just now beginning to hope that rest might be possible after all. The inn would be there. It would always be there. For you, for them, for anyone who needed it. Light for the lost. Rest for the weary. Home, for however long you needed. The forest path stretched ahead, dappled with sunlight, and you walked it with a light heart, carrying your small lantern, carrying your peace, carrying the memory of the lantern inn like a blessing. The journey continued. And you were ready. The end. May you always find the light when you need it most.